the way that this video would kill if I could do a British accent.
It's a story about a world very different from ours.
'Tis a world where all people are equal and no conflict exists, much like the world His Highness once dreamt of.
To put it another way, this is a fantasy.
Metaphor ReFantazio is the latest JRPG to come out of Atlus's Studio Zero. It was met with both critical and commercial acclaim, selling over 1 million copies just in its launch day, and it is the fastest selling game that Atlus has ever published. What can I say? We are in a little bit of a Persona drought. Besides a little cash grab side game here and there, we are so hungry for new Persona adjacent content. And Metaphor satisfies that appetite more than a Persona follow-up perhaps ever could. Studio Zero is a more recent addition to Atlus's development branches, and many of its key team members are responsible for bringing us the modern Persona trilogy. This benefits Metaphor in several ways. For anyone who doesn't know, Persona is a series of games that follow a group of high school students solving some sort of mystery that has a supernatural lean, and they all get unique personas to use in combat that offer specific skills. The game does a sort of tightrope walk between the social sim elements and the combat elements. It's really focused on how you spend your time, and the more passive everyday tasks that you do, like spending time with friends, pursuing hobbies, bettering yourself academically, those can all have impacts in the combat side when you're fighting against monsters. So that takes place in a modern high school setting. Metaphor is the same thing, just applied to a slightly older cast in a medieval fantasy setting. I think the fact that Metaphor is a new IP that's very intrinsically attached to an existing franchise benefits it in several ways. There's already an established fan base that has goodwill with these developers, and despite this game being covered in Persona's fingerprints, there are little to no expectations placed on Metaphor because we don't want it to be Persona 6. We want it to be something else. We simultaneously expect it to be Persona and not Persona. The comparisons are inevitable. But Metaphor is undeniably a new thing, and as long as the material is good, it is so well positioned to succeed. And succeed it did. Normally, I attempt to be contrarian to some extent. I love to critique the hits if I see something that other people aren't, and I love to find overlooked hidden gems. I mean, I was Josh Safdie's muse when he wrote Uncut Gems, like things like that. I love to find overlooked hidden gems and present them to you. For Metaphor, I think its reception matches its execution, and it really deserves the accolades it's receiving. Fortunately and unfortunately, I am a critic by nature, so by no means do I think this game is perfect. I think it's marred by a really bad beginning, an underwhelming cast of villains, the pacing gets a little bit messy, especially towards the end. The game has a lot of breathing room at the beginning, and then I find as we approach the ending, it starts to sprint faster and faster. So we get less time with those important moments, and aspects of its presentation make it feel like it isn't a big studio project with a huge budget that's been in development for probably 10 plus years. But when Metaphor hits, it hits. It's really wonderful. And I mean, the proposition of fantasy Persona is really irresistible. The game was first teased back in 2016 as Project ReFantazio with this key art of a red-haired elven knight. This character was all over the teaser material throughout the years and has appeared in several different forms. My hope at the time was that she would be the main character. We obviously know now that this isn't the case, but there has been a desire for girl self-inserts in Atlus games for a long time because they're always boys. Rest in power, Kotone. Another trailer dropped in 2017 in which a man says he needs to finish writing his book, which is a fantasy novel describing a utopia similar to our reality, but if there was actually equality and peace. We then get these shots of live actors in okay costumes with some D&D class descriptions. The trailer doesn't give us much, but it does confirm that the central concept of a contemporary utopia written from the perspective of a fictional medieval author has been consistent throughout the game's entire development. Now, as much as I covet your watch time, please turn off the ad block, hit up the Patreon, hit up the coffee. I really want to buy a teleprompter. And they're so expensive. This video will contain major spoilers, obviously, for the plot. So if that's something that will annoy you, I'll let you know when to click off. It's really clear. There's an outfit change. You'll know. you'll know when you need to leave. I'm going to start off with my non-spoiler opinions, which already cover a lot. The game is absolutely a banger. I feel like Metaphor takes everything Persona is good at and does it just a little bit better. The story is pretty cohesive from beginning to end. The combat is engaging. It really forces you to change your party composition to tackle different problems. And unlike Persona, Metaphor actually has a lot to say about society. Persona loves to act like it's making social commentary while adamantly refusing to commit to any conclusion about society or the world we live in. Maybe because Metaphor plays in a medieval fantasy setting, it feels safer to address problems in a world that's like distant from ours. Oh my God, I don't know the quote. I read a really interesting quote recently that, proposed that using fictional texts that take place in different worlds. I feel like it must have been in a review for this game because I've been reading quite a bit of coverage elsewhere. I feel like a famous fantasy author said something along these lines, but fictional worlds that are different from ours make it easier to comment on problems that are happening in our world. Compared to Persona, Metaphor is quite political. I found that the characters were consistently engaged with the world from beginning to end and bringing up some pretty solid arguments, some pretty good counterpoints. I mean, at times, you know what I mean? Like the 10% of the time when the characters who have a lot of power aren't doing something wickedly authoritarian, there can be little nuggets of wisdom. I have repeatedly brought up wanting a game that makes me feel the way that Game of Thrones did in terms of political and narrative intrigue. I wanted this from Triangle Strategy. I wanted this from Final Fantasy 16. Literally in my wildest dreams, Three Houses might be able to do something like that. None of these games really got me off in that way. Disgusting. I don't know if Metaphor is that for me completely, but there were moments where I was so gripped by the story that I think it's like the closest in terms of like comparable entertainment value. You have several plausible ideologies in conflict with each other, and the characters have interesting enough motivations. Like, I was really in it. The tweet version of the plot is that the king has been assassinated and the prince is in a curse-induced coma. The curse is thorny. It's very Shion from Tales of Arise. Through divine magical intervention, the king's spirit says his successor will be chosen via this new system called democracy. The people will decide who the next king is going to be. The player follows a self-insert main character. For the sake of this video, we're going to call him Will, along with his fairy companion Gallica. The story takes place in the United Kingdom of Uchronia. Uchronia in the history of language is a relatively new word. It either means a utopian era, or Uchronia without the E can also be used to mean an alternate history in speculative fiction. Utopia is going to come up a lot, so it'll be good to have that highlighted in the whiteboard of your minds. The country is made up of 8 different tribes who all have some sort of unique physical trait. The Clamar are basically D&D humans but with thorns. They're pretty average. They're the most populous tribe. The royal lineage has also historically been Clamar. The Rusant, I already forgot how they said it in the game. They are the second most populous. They have elven ears and a stronger constitution than most, so they're known as a very tough people and a little bit more prone to anger. They are very successful in military roles. The Rogue have the least unique physical characterization. They have a range of muted skin tones, and they have an extremely long lifespan. It looks like they have face tattoos, but it's actually just makeup. Some of them have slightly pointed ears. It's hard to tell. We only meet so many Rogue characters throughout the game. I thought that they all had gray eyes, but that's also not true. Just for the sake of the game's conceit, I do wish that they weren't the only tribe without a specific visible characteristic. Just make the makeup a birthmark, give them gray eyes, do something, make a choice. The Nydia have big jewel-like eyes and bright hair colors. They are also known to be quite charismatic. They tend not to leave the village they were born in until they reach maturity as well. The Ishkia are the last of the tribes that are relatively well liked. They have 2 pairs of wings, typically growing out of their hips, giving them an angelic look despite not being able to fly. They are the least populous of the tribes, but they tend to hold high positions in the church or within academia. The remaining 3 tribes are all pretty disliked because discrimination. Hate that. The Parapis have similar populations to the Clamar and the Rusant, but they are a disproportionately impoverished people. They have animalistic features, particularly ears and tails, and they are the butt of the joke because they're furries. That's a very unserious sentence, but like in a legitimate way. In the circumstances of the world, they are treated like animals because they look like animals. The Mustari have a 3rd eye that can see magla, which is like a chemical equivalent of magic that's just a vapor in the air. And of course, they can't just call it magic because every fantasy property needs slightly different verbiage to describe the same things. The Mustari are considered pagans because they don't practice sanctism, the main religion of Uchronia. They also wear these bulky helmets that cover their eyes as a part of their worship. Lastly, the Ujif are little bat people. Like the Ishkia, they can't fly, but they have other bat-like qualities, so stronger hearing, night vision. They're generally quite agile. Because of the discrimination they face, the Ujif tend to stay in their own villages, but it's not uncommon for them to live in the larger cities. I know I only said that there are 8 tribes, but the game only says there are 8 tribes, and they know it's misleading, and now you know it's misleading. I've already mentioned that Gallica is a fairy, and Will is an Elda. Both tribes are highly magical, but we don't learn much about them at all until way later. There's heavy stigma around the Elda. They are the absol of this universe. I just watched Jirachi Witchmaker for the first time in a really long time, so it's on my brain, meaning it's generally believed that calamity follows them. At first I thought everyone could tell Will is an Elda because he's hetero, but it's because he doesn't have any discernible physical traits. He looks just like a normal human. But human, quote unquote, has a different meaning in this universe. There are normal fantasy monsters in Metaphor. You've got your orcs. You've got some freaky birds, but the big threatening ones are called humans. They are based on the work of Hieronymus Bosch, particularly his work, The Garden of Earthly Delights. We'll see this more when we discuss the bosses. They're quite grotesque. Their designs are intentionally supposed to be quite freaky, and they mix human parts with non-human parts. So I think they're really supposed to have that uncanny valley feeling to them. Will and Gallica are tasked with finding a way to break the prince's curse. It's generally believed that the curse was placed by Luis Gueburn, a high-ranking Clamar military official who also commits the regicide that gets the plot moving. That's not a spoiler, it's literally the first scene in the game. The only way to break a curse is either to kill its caster or find the magic formula to undo it. Magic is complicated in this world. Magla exists, but it can't be accessed without the use of an igniter, and the only ones that are being produced at the moment have military uses, but they are available for general sale in stores. If it sounds weird that the general public can buy bracelets that shoot fire, but no one is making these magical tools for simple everyday use, it is weird, and you should file that thought away for later. These are the general circumstances of the world. In terms of gameplay, Metaphor does everything Persona does, just like 20% less. Metaphor uses a calendar system where you choose what Will does every day, but there are only 5 days a week. And instead of going from April to December, Metaphor runs from June to October. There is a social link system where Will has scenes with the supporting cast that follow their own personal side stories, but there are only 14 of these links instead of like 22, and they have 8 event conversations instead of 10 each. Metaphor also uses a social stat system where Will develops these soft skills in order to talk to his friends, and it's represented by this beautiful crown stat screen. It would be so crazy if Will was the prince. No. Metaphor is a lot less rigid in its calendar compared to Persona. I found it much easier to max out each stat and social link while still having some wiggle room at the end. If I don't follow a guide for Persona, I'm cooked. But Metaphor, you can kind of relax. If you have some foresight, you can play this as a pretty normal person without having to follow a walkthrough, and you'll be able to see a lot of the game. The combat uses an action token system. You get 1 token per active party member, and exploiting enemy weaknesses only uses half of a token. So the main objective is to hit these weaknesses so you can do as much as possible in a single turn. The combat is shaped by the archetype job system, which are the embodiment of the heroes of old that the player can inhabit in order to cast spells without an igniter. They're basically D&D classes, and the system functions very similarly to Bravely Default if anybody has played that, where you select a class, but then you can also pick skills from the other classes to use. You have a certain number of slots to do that in, so there is a little bit of flexibility. I found the combat really engaging. Like I said, the game does force you to switch up your party composition quite often. There are some strategies that are pretty rinse and repeat for a lot of situations, but the game is good at punishing people who don't listen. My main critique for the combat is that a lot of the same enemies get reused. The orcs have no weaknesses, and they don't like sticks, so you can't bring magic users. And the big birds don't like it when people are in the front row, and they're all weak to pierce. And if you piss any of them off, they'll cry like a little bitch baby, and then they'll gain 10 turn icons and try to wipe your entire team. This repetitiveness that I mentioned with the enemies is really reflective of my main gripe with Metaphor. It feels somewhat unfinished. There's a lack of polish, and that either came from a limitation in budget or a limitation in schedule. And I'm not confident that it was a budget issue. If I had to speculate, if we assume that the teaser trailer was the day they conceived of this idea, the game has been in development for 8 years, and the team at Studio Zero have done work on other titles in that time, but I don't think it was a budget issue. I think maybe a year and a half ago, the game was in an okay spot, like they'd finished writing it for the most part, and they have a thing that runs well, but I just have a gut feeling that some executive at Atlas was like, okay, kiddos, you have to have this out by October of 2024. That's the deadline we're giving you, so get a move on. Like visually, for sure, there's a lack of dungeon variety. They reuse the same tower 3 times in different areas, and the other dungeons that aren't the tower style are underground cave style. Oh, there's also outside woods dungeons. Sorry, I'm a liar, actually. There's 3. And those are for the side quests. Obviously, the main dungeons are each unique, but then there's a distinct lack of full voice acting. A lot of characters that have unique 3D models don't have character portraits for their dialogue scenes, which I find really odd. There's a lot of major characters, especially in the social link conversations, that should have official artwork that just don't. And it's a shame because the voice acting and the art of this game are excellent. It just makes it seem like a concession they had to make due to a limitation, not because they weren't capable. Like, for example, Persona 3 Reload came out earlier this year. That was made by a different team, but I do think they're comparable products in that they're made by the same company for the same target market and are structurally very similar, but Reload has full voice acting, and I think it benefits so much from that, and I think it's a shame that Metaphor doesn't. Atlas is very bad at budgeting and properly estimating what its audiences want, so am I surprised necessarily that they didn't let Studio Zero's actual flagship work cook a little longer? I'm not, but I think it was a mistake. LOL, this transition might be so jarring. But scene change.
Hello, I'm Sophie of the Ishkia people, and today we're gonna be talking about who I think has had a little bit of work done, who's been touched by an angel. Rella Cygnus,
Rhinoplasty,
Muras,
Rhinoplasty,
Milo,
Rhinoplasty.
and me. I'll never tell.
I literally spent 2 hours trying to get ready to look like Rella, and I can't help but think it's not giving. I hope me in the past did a good job of explaining my non-spoiler thoughts. We're hitting that point in the video where if you don't want to know the specifics of what happens in this game, I'm afraid you are going to have to click off. Subscribe, like, maybe sprinkle in a little bit of engagement before you go. But this game is really good. So I would suggest, if you're interested in playing it, maybe add this to the watch later. Go play the game and then come back once you've finished. The story is really excellent. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the narrative that I'm not going to talk about, so I still think there's a good appeal to go play the game for yourself, even having watched this. I really managed to dodge any media coverage for this game, not on purpose. I wasn't trying to. So I had a relatively spoiler-free experience with Metaphor, and honestly, I really enjoyed it. Most of the games that I've played so far in 2024, I either didn't necessarily love, or they were remakes of a game that I'm already familiar with. So it was really refreshing to experience a story that I'm not familiar with at all. Not knowing what was going to happen in this new story really filled the journey with surprise and delight. Without further ado, this is my abridged retelling of Metaphor ReFantazio. One thing to note is that the game does open with a disclaimer saying that this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to anything that has ever happened to anybody ever is purely coincidental. But then they also make it a point to say that they don't necessarily endorse the actions taken in this game, and criticisms levied against the government, military, and church should not be taken as calls to action. Metaphor has a lot of radical ideas, given the fact that recently someone was elected to a really high position in public office. I don't know if you've heard of it. You know, someone did a little ear damage. Could you imagine if someone played this game and went, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go out and I'm going to be the change. That's kind of a lot. I believe art is really meaningful, but I don't know if Metaphor has the power to inspire like that. I don't know. Anywho, I've already mentioned Luis assassinating King Hythlodius V and the Prince's Curse being the broad impetus that gets the plot moving. Will and Gallica have been tasked by some nebulous resistance group to take out Luis. Their first step is meeting up with a resistance informant who is an army soldier. Will is carrying with him a copy of a fantasy novel describing this metropolitan utopia, and he reads it quite often. They arrive at the capital, and we're immediately exposed to the intensity of this world's speciesism. There's a lot of talk between the duo about how the Elda people are exceedingly rare. So despite being on a covert mission where you wouldn't want to draw attention, you couldn't do a little Nikki Tutorials rogue makeup moment. I'm sure you could fashion a pair of fake horns if this was an issue. I'm not saying Will should have to hide his race, but if we're talking about not getting noticed, zero efforts were made. I like Will, but I do think it hurts him as a character to be a self-insert because all of the dialogue about his personhood and his tribe become immediately depersonalized. Not to give notes on how to be a better racist, but the voice lines have to be recorded around the fact that he doesn't have a canon name. They just call him the Elda boy pretty much the whole time, which moment to moment for me felt dehumanizing. And then I remembered that they're just calling him that because he can't have a name. It could have been an interesting choice to give him a name, and then the characters who are shitty to him regardless just elect to not call him that. Anyways, Will gets accosted by some men in the sign up line, and Stroll, a woke Clamar stranger, stands up for us. Stroll really fulfills the stock character role in Atlas games of best friends who are so nice and kind of obsessed with the protagonist to the point where you're like, Stroll must want to sleep with Will. Stroll just keeps following Will around. They travel to some outpost where, shocker, there's a human attack. Now, if I were 18 and making this video, I feel like I wouldn't be laughing at this, but the fact that all of the human monsters are called Homo something, it's a little funny. It's a little funny. Especially because the first boss is called Homo Gorleo. Homo Girl. I love Homo Girl. Homo Girl is me. She is me and I am her. And that's representation in gaming. And you know what? In terms of gay people in this game, Homo Girl is all we're gonna get. Humans are terrifying, deadly creatures that most ordinary soldiers can't kill. Gorleo raises the fort, which is extra bad because our informant is supposed to be stationed here. Will and Stroll go to face Homo Girl 666. I tried to find if there were any hidden meanings to the boss names. I didn't turn up anything. I think they're just made up. But if you know something that I don't, I would love to hear it. Stroll falls during the fight, and it's looking bad for Will for a second, and then he hears a woman's voice in a forest temple telling him to not succumb to weakness and that he can achieve power, unlocking our first archetype, the Seeker, specializing in wind magic and support skills. It's all very dramatic. Will rips out his heart, which is important for later, and it's like a metal microphone heart that I didn't realize they have a canon name. They're called resonant vessels. He yells his convictions into it, and then his body and eyes begin glowing orange as he starts channeling Magla. Will defeats the human, saving Stroll, and once the battle is over, we meet Grius, an older rogue knight and our resistance contact. The men travel back to the capital through an abandoned mine with Gallica serving as their navigator in an effort to take down Luis. Stroll is let in on the plan and shares that he is a former noble of Halia, but a human destroyed his home, and Grius shares that Luis was likely involved and the army could have probably done something to prevent the tragedy. So Stroll becomes a full-fledged party member. During their first night camping, Will goes to the Velvet Room. Academia. He goes to Academia, but it has a funny old English spelling. I don't think I performed that very well. It's a blue room with a mysterious man. It's the same as the Velvet Room. Here he meets Moore, who is Clamar, and he's the author of the fantasy novel. His name is almost undeniably based on Thomas More, the author who wrote the novel Utopia. Academia is where we can upgrade and switch our archetype abilities. The UI is unfortunately really annoying when it comes to switching your loadout, which sucks, but it is what it is. Moore's social link is how we develop the Seeker line. Back to Uchronia. The party makes it to the mines, and Will's new companions both awaken to the archetype powers as well. Notably, Stroll has a scene similar to Will's where the woman also speaks to him in the forest and he unlocks the warrior archetype, which focuses on dealing slashing damage. Grius does not have an awakening scene or an associated archetype. It kind of just happens to him without fanfare. At some point, our connection to Gallica unlocks the mage archetype, our first magical class option that can use the typical elemental spells that aren't wind. The only thing I care to talk about in the mines is that there's an optional dragon fight, and the game says it'll be really hard, but it's not that crazy, and you get a great sword if you do it. I genuinely thought it was going to be some sort of bait thing to put players in their place, but if you come back and you play it on New Game Plus, you'll be able to beat the dragon. That does happen. It's just a different dragon. Thankfully, this one is level 12, and your party should be level 11. It's pretty fair. We make it back to the capital and stay at the hushed Honeybee Inn run by Fabienne, who is also taking care of Grius' daughter, mixed race rogue Ischia Queen Maria. Sadly, being mixed race in this world is socially unacceptable because the Sanctus Church has deemed interracial relationships to be of the devil. I've not seen that film before. You guys, I don't know if I'm vibing with this church. They seem to be doing the wrong thing often. Maria becomes our first non-party social link, and she's attached to the healer archetype, which unsurprisingly uses, you guessed it, healing magic and light magic as well. I'm worried if I say assassin too much, I might get like flagged or something. The king's funeral is coming up, and the guys are thinking that that's the perfect day to like get Louise. You know what I mean? If I say get with some intensity, that means they're getting schmilled. In the background, the head of the church, Sanctifex Forden, and Louise are in conflict for the throne. Sanctism is the state religion, so Forden is like, it should be me up there. And Luis hates the way the kingdom is run and he wants to change it. Luis is a very charismatic man with intense ideals, and the people are wanting change. An unfamiliar set of circumstances, truly. Luis also promises equality between the tribes and social status based on merit, which sounds great on paper, but then when he talks about culling the weak, it really gives me pause. The day of the funeral comes. Luis interrupts the ceremony by parking his jet in the town square and announcing his vie for the throne. Then the craziest thing happens. Everything I have been describing so far was incredibly boring to play through, in my opinion. I did not like the opening hours of this game at all. Too much exposition without any inciting incident feels like being on a date at an amazing restaurant with the most boring person on the planet, and they insist on telling you the dumbest story you've ever heard, and you're just waiting for your delicious meal to come, but you don't want to leave, right? I was really concerned that metaphor would be a DNF for me because I really wasn't into it. And that's when the palace erupts from the ground in Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom fashion. And on the underside of this floating island is an ugly version of the king's head, who posthumously invents democracy and decrees that by his divine right of kings, his successor will be chosen by the will of the people. And both the island and the newly erected statues around the kingdom will change to show who is leading the race.
More public support, bigger face on the rock.
Magic is a rarity in this world, but the royal bloodline has been venerated because they can wield a huge amount of magic very easily. It's hard for people to cast magic while walking, but the fact that he can maintain a spell while in the afterlife is actually wild. The king will be chosen in October, and everyone's a candidate for the throne. So if you can develop enough clout by then, you're in it. During the king's speech, great movie, never saw it, Grius goes to strike, but Luis is a prime candidate. So the king's magic stops Grius and is going to kill him for interfering with the will of the people. I've been around the fantasy JRPG block a couple times before, so I saw premature father figure death coming from a mile away, especially because his young daughter is the pinnacle of innocence and looks like a literal angel. So like they can really milk the tragedy, right? I was so grateful that something interesting finally happened. You wouldn't believe it. The aftermath of this gets extremely messy. A human is dropped in the town square. One of Luis's supporters, the necromancer Zorba, is raising bodies from the dead to fight. Disaster strikes really quickly. Hulkenberg emerges from the crowd. She's a Russaint knight and former comrade of Grius. She's the redhead elf in all of the teaser materials. She joins us in resolving the immediate issue of the evil skeleton bodies, but we learn that Zorba is preparing a spell in the cathedral. It'll be bad for everybody, etc., etc. And the party sets a deadline to prevent this. Very Persona 5. At this point, the game really opens up and lets you actually do stuff. You're not locked on rails so much anymore. You can take side quests and meet a couple more social links. We learn that Hulkenberg used to be the prince's royal guard, and she was there the night that he was cursed and disappeared. She believed he was alive, and so she's continued to search for him, and she's glad to get definitive proof through Will and Gallica that the prince is out there somewhere. She awakens to the knight archetype, a more defensive job that can tank hits. Now that we have our core party, you can't tell me that this isn't Makoto, Yukari, Akihiko, and Mitsuru. They're just missing a Junpei, but he's gonna come later. Will meets Brigitte, an affluent rogue woman who owns a big igniter shop. She's the social link attached to the merchant archetype, where you can spend some cash to attack enemies instead of using MP. The party infiltrates the Grand Regolith Cathedral. You run into Katharina here. She's a Parapus bounty hunter, and one of her friends is inside the cathedral, and she asks us to go rescue her friend because she got severely injured. Unfortunately, the friend is already dead, dead by the time we get to her, but Katharina still thanks us for attempting to help. This unlocks the Brawler archetype, which deals physical strike damage and uses HP to cast instead of MP. Near the top of the cathedral, we learn that Zorba, mixed race Clamar, and Mustari, queer icon in his heels. He's absolutely obsessed with Luis in like a scary, manic, idol worshipping way. He's like the equivalent of like a BTS army. You know what I mean? A blink. We defeat Zorba and are immediately launched into fighting the human in the square. Homo Avades is very clearly based on this figure in Bosch's work. Neither boss fight is really too challenging, but the enemy design of Avades is really cool. Once the human is defeated, Will gets a little bit of clout. People are pretty awestruck that an Elden person saved the city. The follower tracking system is very reminiscent of Persona 5's, which was also very interested in gauging the public's perception of the group. In the meantime, the church has been orchestrating a stunt to control the narrative, so they create their own tournament in which candidates have to complete tasks set out by the church. Luis initially doesn't participate in this because he knows that the church's actions have no bearing on the actual outcome of the contest. They're not linked to the king's magic, so they don't have any say in that, so he doesn't have to legitimize the event by entertaining their rules. In a gambit to gain Luis's attention in hopes of getting closer to him, the party enters the church contest and Will officially announces his candidacy. International songstress Juna performs at the event. Most of the people at this opening ceremony are nobodies. They're interesting side characters, but they don't do anything particularly relevant beyond adding flavor. The most notable secondary candidates are Guido, a Roussant church official, and Glodel, a Parapus supporter of Luis. I don't like that they both have G names, but the important part is that both of these characters are essentially competing on behalf of a more important person, and if they end up winning the contest for whatever reason, they'll give up the throne for the person that they're serving. The first task is to bring a monster head to Port Brilehaven. How are we gonna travel? To even participate in the contest, we need a gauntlet runner, which is a freaky car with legs, in order to get from place to place without being absolutely devoured by monsters. Thankfully, Will has effortlessly attached himself to two very well-connected people in practically no time, so Hulkenberg has asked her old friend Nuris to loan out his gauntlet runner for the race. Nuris is an Ishkia engineer, my sister, who used to work for the royal family before the prince went missing, and the runner that we're using was originally built for the prince. Nuris is the quirky old mad scientist type. He certainly offers some comedic relief. He's also attached to the gunner archetype, which deals piercing damage that can inflict status conditions. The group goes to the recruitment center to see if there's any bounties worth taking on, but Stroll notices one for a night deserter named Heisme Noctul, who is kidnapping children around Martira. Barden, a Roussant knight of Martira, hears that we're interested in the bounty and practically begs us to save his home, believing that we'll be able to take out Heisme since we took out the human. Stroll thinks that this is good PR. Everyone else is going to bring monsters classic flavor, so Will can stand out by bringing someone who is just a bad person. They travel to Martira in their new Bentley, and part of the game now is considering travel time between locations, especially for the side quests. Crazily enough, there is a sort of generator in the engine room that responds to Will when it was meant for the prince, and it teleports the group back to Grand Trad in an instant. This is how they incorporate fast travel. You can go between major locations right away, but you'll still have to drive to the side locations. You can also run into other candidates while en route. You run into Guido and Glodel mid-fight. See, their names are so similar too, like, isn't it filthy? Since the game wants us to get close to Luis, I chose to help Glodel. After the fight with Godot wraps, we have a somewhat comedic relief scene.
The kingdom's greatest singer, the dulcet diva!
You're an interesting little ensemble. Wait, is that a fairy? A real living one? Where did you...
She's like annoyed that no one else cares that they're meeting a celebrity. Juna also really takes note of the group. Once arriving in Martira, our key players are obviously Barden, his fellow knight Morris, and leader of the town, Sanctoress Joanna. I sound really fancy saying that. There's weird stuff going on. Clearly someone is withholding information because the motivations really aren't making sense. The party eats these sandworm dishes at the inn, and I really thought something really fucked up and sinister was happening with the food, but it is just an avenue to introduce Hulkenberg as resident foodie. Morris gives us some bad information on how to get to Heisme's hideout. The group gets caught in a sandstorm before fighting a giant human sandworm, which eats and then shits them out. I'm not joking. We get to this desert hideout ravaged by other sandworms, and unsurprisingly, there are no kidnapped children, and Heisme is just living alone in a tent in a cave. We learn that he is a Ujif and a former member of the Shadow Guard, which is like the Black Ops section of the army where they make the quote unquote lesser races do more dangerous or incriminating missions. We also explore his tent and find the cremated remains of his son. So this whole bounty story is really starting to feel racially motivated. Heisme is like, grr, I'm gonna kill you, but he's just trying to get us to go away. His only crime was being born New Chief, and that made him a really easy scapegoat for the real crime going on somewhere else that we have to go solve. We travel back to Martira with Heisme in order to trick the leadership into admitting that something weird is happening. And since Heisme has super bat hearing, he can tell that there are children under the castle. We go down there and we find that Morris was kidnapping the children. Not shocking. He's being a freak and he's feeding them to a human in the form of an evil baby doll head. It's really freaky. I don't like it. Morris was doing it for cash so that he can leave the village, but he's not the true mastermind. Heisme awakens to an archetype and joins our party after realizing he can better honor his son's legacy in that way. He wasn't around to protect his kid when he was in the army, but he can protect these children now. He definitely takes on the role that Grius likely would have played had he lived. Heisme is your uncle who occasionally says out-of-pocket things at the dinner table. We'll get there. He accesses the thief archetype line, which unsurprisingly steals, and also has access to dark magic. To give you an idea of how unspoiled I was, I truly thought Will, Stroll, and Hulkenberg were just going to be the party throughout the whole game. I think in part that's due to the fact that the playstyle is very similar to Bravely Default, and you have the same characters throughout the whole game, and the point of it is just exploiting the flexibility and really switching your characters between classes. I thought that would be kind of the crux of the gameplay, but it was nice to get more characters, especially because you get an extra turn token when you have a party of 4, and I think it serves to soften the difficulty curve that the beginning kind of had. It wasn't that hard, but if you can do more in a single turn, that's huge. We traversed through this whole underground dungeon and learned that Joanna was behind the kidnappings because she has deep maternal trauma. At first, I wasn't sure what the vibe was going to be with Joanna, but honestly, they write her as such a sympathetic villain, and all is revealed once we make it to this terrifying nursery where we see that at one point she commissioned a gorgeous painting of herself while pregnant, and then she gave birth to that child, and then her nanny jilled the baby because Joanna is rogue and she was with a man who was not. And as we've already established, being mixed race is unfortunately a big no-no. And when you're a person of a certain status, that becomes more important. File that away for later. So losing a kid, really damaging canon event for her. She has begun projecting these really complicated feelings onto the evil baby head and says, the town took my kid away from me, so why can't I take theirs? And to that I say, maybe not the right course of action, but points were made. Obviously she's wrong, but I can't help but applaud a complex female villain. We get them so rarely, and I loved Joanna. I thought her arc was so thrilling. This is Heisme's arc, right? Because he's being introduced here, but he obviously takes a more forward role in this discussion as the more mature party member. Also, as someone who lost a child, he is able to relate to her experience a lot more and also point out why this might not be the right path for her. The boss fight is okay. Homo Jaluzo is whatever. At least it eats Morris. He was a huge asshole, so I'm glad to see him go. But it certainly confirms that there is some link between humans, the monsters, and people, because Joanna's magic definitely affected Boss Baby. And then she also had a big attitude shift once it was defeated, so it was obviously affecting her mind to some degree, or engaging in a sort of confirmation bias where she already felt a certain way, and then the human monster brought bad vibes, and then it was just kind of like negativity begets negativity. She agrees to offer her head for the tournament as a means of atoning for what she did. Before leaving Martira, Will meets Alonzo, a Nydia conman, and the social link related to the Faker archetype, which mostly has debuffing skills. Next stop is Port Brilehaven in Oceania, the kingdom to the south of Uchronia. We mostly wait around for the ceremony to start, and of course we present our monster last because that has the highest narrative payoff. Juna keeps making little comments to Luis's camp about us. She's really invested in what we're up to for some reason. Joanna confesses to her crimes, and Forden is like, I believe you, and gets her in the middle of the Colosseum in front of everybody, ending the first round on a bit of a grim note, but it earns Will a lot of attention. Barden becomes a link a little while later. He unlocks the commander line, which has physical elemental attacks as opposed to magic attacks, and some some party-wide defensive buff skills. Right now, we're just waiting for the church to announce the second round, and Luis invites us onto his ship, the Caradrius. We pledge unyielding loyalty to Luis, and he's like, okay, you guys are being weird. Luis is going to be hosting a party a little bit later, so our group plans some Scooby-Doo level hijinks and prep to infiltrate the ship so that they can find the Krabby Patty formula, the curse formula. They're looking for the curse formula. Gallica has her like useful moment in the story because she's teeny tiny skinny legend. Where's her waist? It's missing. I really disappeared into that for a second. Anyways, she can fly through the vents, so she figures it out. They set their infiltration route before the deadline. The party then attends the gala, and Will leaves after making an appearance. Stroll gets into it with Luis. They have an argument, which was kind of wild, and then Luis announces that he'll be officially joining the church contest in the second round. Will is on the ship, and shit starts going wrong. The ship, for whatever reason, starts and begins flying in the air, and then Will has like a really stupid Sonic-esque scene where he rides on his, I haven't talked about the skateboard sword, the skate sword. Basically, the prince used to ride around on his royal sword, and now Will has the sword and he rides around on it like a skateboard. Surely it means nothing. Also, one of the most annoying trophies to get in this game was the skateboard for a long time. I fast traveled everywhere, but if you want the trophy, I would recommend using the skateboard. Don't fast travel, because I literally had to use the rubber band method, and I've never used that in my entire life, and it took about 35 minutes to unlock that trophy. I turned my TV off and I went to go get food. I left and came back and it still wasn't done. We make it to Luis's personal quarters, and then literally the most incredible scene in the history of gaming happens. Roll the clip.
So, remember how I said I'd keep my eyes on you? Well, I have to say, I like what I see.
Hey, get away from him!
I don't suppose we could keep my little investigation secret. I'll keep quiet about you too, now that we're accomplices.
Juna, someone from Luis's camp, is revealed to be another resistance spy and was waiting for Gallica to bring her next orders. She knew Grius as well. They were in cahoot. What? Cahoot? They were in cahoot? They were in cahoots with one another? Is that a phrase? They knew each other. We also find out that Luis has a copy of the fantasy novel in his study. Huge. Will finds the written formula to the curse, but it feels unfinished. Glodell notices that Will is missing and heads back to the ship. There's this big standoff. Juna reveals that she's already familiar with archetypes, which is wild because, like the Elda people, the archetypes are supposed to be an extinct, relatively unknown magic, and she awakens to the power of the masked dancer, which can make enemies weak to certain elements and equip masks as an accessory that lets it use skills from other classes without actually equipping them, leaving extra slots. Juna and Will team up for a pretty dramatic fight. Juna has some Rachel Berry level quips about being a singer.
I am Juani's Cygnus. I am no one's trinket. My life is my own to protect, and I will accept nothing less.
How does she have the same power? She's just a damn singer!
Never underestimate a singer! Every song is a burden. The weight of a lifetime.
Never underestimate a singer. My accent work is not good. They defeat Glodell and he tries to deliver a killing blow on Will, but Will's famous now. He gets caught in the king's magic, and the chains kill him instantly. It was drama. Espa on the scene, one look give him whiplash. Fidelio and Basilio, I will refer to them as Del, and honestly I refer to Basilio mostly in his full name in the script, but I might call them Del and Baz for the sake of efficiency. They're Luis's two Parapis retainers. They come and find us after the fight, and Del, the shorter purple one, he's very shrew, very astute. He smells a stunt. He's like, Juna, you didn't come to the party because you said you had a little bit of a sore throat. And now here you are, Dulcet Diva, fighting on the deck of the ship with Little Miss Hetero. What's that about? Juna lies, obviously, but Del and Baz are onto us. Another thing about Juna is that she is the adoptive sister of saint and expert healer Rella, who was the inspo for the look today. Rella has been kind of in the background with the Sanctists. She's been present for a lot of the big events. She might get a line in here or there. Juna and Rella attended the Mage Academy, which was shut down for presently unknown reasons, and this is part of why Rella is an advanced healer and Juna is basically an expert on magic. They teleport to a church in Grand Trad and meet up with Rella so that she can look over the formula that we took. She confirms that it's incomplete and that the curse can't be broken without the full spell. We also learned that Rella was responsible for stabilizing the prince's condition, but she's being weird about it. So certainly there's more to the story. Everyone in this world has secrets with a capital S. This closes out the first act. Forden announces that the next task is to recover lost magic relics and return them to the church, which is code for taking pagan items of importance from the Mustari. It's in the same vein of like white people taking cultural artifacts from other places in the world that aren't white and holding them captive in museums and not giving them back to their culture of origins. That's the vibe. Luis announces he will be participating in this round, and he tasks our group with getting the legendary dragon lance Dracodios, which is like the most important relic of the Mustari. This brings us to the Virga Islands in the middle of the sea. Conveniently, Nuris in the background this whole time, he doesn't really participate in the plot. He's mostly like, I'm staying in the car, you guys do your thing, but I'll be here. And he's just passively working on it the whole time. So conveniently, when the narrative demands it, we can swim now. Del and Basilio don't trust us yet, so Juna is like, you can come and be my bodyguards if you want. I've got nothing to hide. Queen of deception, truly. Heisme has what feels like a random racist outburst, while the Parapus guys are just somewhere else on this very small boat. Like, we were just trying to enjoy the chicken. Why'd you have to go and do all that? Del and Bass walk in and the room goes silent, and they're like, what were you guys talking about? And they were like, clouds in the sky is that's what we were talking about. Have you guys seen there's a lot of fish in the ocean? It does address it later, but it's inadequate in my opinion. It really is a huge L when your group is applauded for breaking boundaries when it comes to inclusivity, and then suddenly the call is coming from inside the house. I really liked how Heisme was incorporated into the story up until this point, but the first 3 party members that we meet really take a backseat narratively to make space for the next 3. So Heisme has this like pretty shitty moment and then disappears from the story. Like, he's around to give an opinion every now and again, but this is his last like notable event. This scene is just so antithetical to the game's messaging. It leaves me disappointed that they pose this scenario where, taken in good faith, you're working with someone who's essential to your cause, but then does something that creates a lot of friction within the group, and no reasonable effort is made by anybody around Heisme to say like, hey, what you said like really wasn't nice. It was really out of pocket, and maybe you should work on that because you have a bias that runs really deep, and that has nothing to do with these 2 men. I just feel like the bare minimum would have been some sort of dialogue about it and perhaps an apology for things to like smooth over. I'll get into what they do, because I laughed. I can already anticipate that I'm going to get a lot of similar comments being like, well, Heisme's kid got trampled to death by a group of Parapus and you overlooked that and you didn't care to address that. So obviously he's going to have certain beliefs, blah, 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 blah. And I hear you. And I get that. I just don't think it makes sense to have one character tell another that the death of a child is not a valid reason. Your trauma doesn't give you a free pass to hurt people, because he really talks Joanna off of that ledge. And then a couple arcs later, he clearly hasn't learned the lesson himself. He doesn't have one-on-one discussions with the Parapus brothers. He gets one line of dialogue near the very end of the game, and that's kind of it. And I just don't think it's enough to warrant the moment, because it also doesn't open up any meaningful conversation with Heisme unpacking these issues. It happens in what feels like a vacuum, because it just goes away. The impacts of this moment aren't felt throughout the game. It happens and then it's done, and then it's almost as if nothing happened at all, and then it is brought back up in one of the last scenes. Those are my clarifying thoughts on the hypocrisy of Heisme. Back to the video. The nuance is just missing. Anyways, we fight a big octopus with an old man head, and the boss fight, pretty easy, but Del really hurts his ankle. His like character is being really annoying and then doing the right thing, and then everyone was like, hey, you're kind of a nice person, and he's like, no, I'm not. I'm evil. In just a second, he's about to save a whole town of people, and then he keeps on being like, I'm bad. Like, it's really insufferable. There are some antics before the plot can actually continue moving. There's a little bit of jail time. We don't need to get into it. We meet Yufa, the priestess of the Mustari people. She's effectively their princess. And we also get to know her hot brother, Adeni, who was around in Brilehaven competing as a candidate. The Mustari have a sort of Aztec belief that sacrificing the priestess will appease the dragon god Et and fix the calamity that has befallen them. Crops are bad, the sheep aren't sheeping, cooking, that kind of thing. So Yufa is going to go to the Dragon Temple on a neighboring island and offer herself up on the slab. We go to the Dragon Temple, and this dungeon was wild. I played on normal difficulty, as I tend to do, and I managed to do each dungeon in a single day of game time because I'm a Persona veteran, so I know that every day, every afternoon is vital. But the Dragon Temple was enormous, and I had to start running away from enemies. For other parts of the game, I did all of the side quests before doing the main dungeon. I think this was the only portion where I did the inverse because I wanted Yufa in my party so that she would get more experience, especially like class EXP. After Juna, I had been spoiled for the other two party members, so I knew that Yufa was going to be joining the cast. I do think going to the Dragon Temple first just caused me to be a little bit underleveled. The upper part of the dungeon is fine, but the lower part is where the game really starts to cook. The game has been dropping hints throughout that before the universe of Metaphor ReFantazio looked the way it does, it looked a lot more like ours. And then there was a huge apocalyptic war that ended everything, and that's confirmed in the Dragon Temple. I also haven't touched on the value of information in this world very much. The church has been doing a very normal, not fascist thing, and they're banning books, and a lot of information is gatekept in order to keep the people unwillfully ignorant and complicit. Like, the history and the context of which they live has been greatly obscured. They do think they just fell out of a coconut tree. The Mustari do worship a dragon, which is a real dragon. It exists. It's not like a lofty idea of God that is willed into existence by collective thought. The dragon is just a dragon, and it's there. It's even the final boss of this dungeon, believe it or not. What I'm about to say isn't confirmed by the game. It is my speculation, but I have a feeling that the Mustari people have been like pushed to the margins of society and called pagans and this, that, and the other thing, in part because their beliefs are just an accurate reflection of the real history of this world. And the Sanctist Church does not like that. The game, I don't think, says that directly, but that's me filling in a blank. There are murals in this temple depicting a huge war where dragons were used to destroy this ancient civilization. This whole area was really reminiscent of Tears of the Kingdom as well. I keep referencing that game. I also feel that Yufa is very Zelda coded. Like, she reminds me so much of Breath of the Wild Zelda. A lot of my guesses on the foreshadowing of this game were right on the money, but I had a theory for a while that the fantasy novel was actually just a history book, which I guess is part true because it's a historical fiction. Underneath the temple itself is a modern building that has been taken over by greenery called Drakengrace Shinjuku, complete with elevators and rundown buses. A portion of this like second half of the dungeon is spent running around and finding items like DVDs. I think they find a cell phone. They also find a calendar that has 7 days instead of 5. And they're like, that's weird. What would people even do with 7 days? We work with 5 days and everything is fine. If I wasn't fighting for my life, this dungeon would have been so fun. And once we make it to the bottom, we fight the dragon Et, who is being controlled by Homo Margo, a human that Yufa notes is wearing a helmet in the same style as the Mustari. Interesting. I kept thinking surely these monsters don't deliberately have human appearances for no reason, right? Like, they don't have the body parts of people for nothing. Functionally, they must be the same as Titans from Attack on Titan, right? And that is true. Yufa is prepared to sacrifice herself, but while they've been traveling through the temple together, the party has kind of reiterated like, hey, you know, I hear you. I see that you want to do this. However, don't you think you could also do a lot for your people by, I don't know, staying alive? You're very powerful, very smart. We just think you have some skills. Hi, our quintuple saw you from across the bar and we really liked your vibe. So the party has been nudging her in this direction, and then the last mural at the bottom depicts the Mustari priestess wielding the dragon lance in order to protect her people. So she's like, actually, that really changes things for me. Yufa has been wearing her mask the whole time throughout this temple, and it's at this point that she explodes it off and awakens to an archetype. Hers is the summoner. Generally, they deal really big elemental damage to all enemies. After defeating the boss, Et is absorbed into the lance. Yufa can see magic because she's Mustari and notes that dragons are just pure forms of magla, and that's what makes the lance a legendary item, is its capacity to absorb all that magic. The human Margot falls into the water below and starts swimming towards the village island, so the party goes back to defend them, and Del and Basilio organize and protect the people, so they at least join in on the relief effort despite being bad. The brothers stayed on the island because a doctor had to treat Del's ankle injury, so they weren't with us during the temple journey. The party defeats Margot. This fight is trickier because Margot can cycle through different weaknesses. After its defeat, the people are initially very disappointed that Yufa didn't Jill herself, but then the party shares that the actual mural says that Yufa should stay alive to protect the people, and she did just that. And regardless of what the mural says, she just saved everybody from a disaster, and no one is being appreciative. A lot of people on the island are really devout when it comes to these practices, but we get the vibe in talking to some characters that there's a divide, and some people don't really think that the whole sacrifice business is right. Adeni and the local innkeep are really the characters who are like, maybe sending a little girl to be eaten by a dragon can't fix our problems. To be clear, Adeni didn't want Yufa to go through with the plan and actually sent us to go stop her. And then during this post-fight scene, the unnamed innkeep is like, aren't you ashamed? Like, he really has an impassioned moment. They are concerned about, like, you know, the crops growing, but Yufa explains that anxiety is the source of magic. So she's like, all of you need to calm down. And once you do, the corn will start growing again. It's actually your fault that the corn won't grow because you have bad vibes. I hate that. I really don't like that that's actually canon. I really don't vibe with the negative feelings are magic angle. I maybe would have accepted strong feelings are magic. Big feelings can be magic. I just don't know why it has to be bad feelings, especially anxiety is the specific word that they keep bringing up often. Maybe there's a deeper symbol there about like the power of a people acting out of fear. Like maybe there's an avenue there, but I just think like what happens when everyone's happy? Magic goes away and they don't need it anymore. It's in the air. Like I don't see that. Brigitte also has a line where she's like, people are creatures of convenience and it's really hard to like backslide and innovation. And I mean, like, we see that. I couldn't live without my phone. What would I look at? The walls? I already do that too. But what would I listen to while looking at the walls without Spotify? I think it's lame. I think like anxiety is a lame angle. Not me being in my anti-mental health era. I just think it's weird that it's anxiety specifically. You know what I mean? I have anxiety and you know what? I don't feel like it's a superpower. And that's kind of what Metaphor ReFantazio is saying. We teleport again to fetch Rella so she can heal Del's ankle. The brothers have met her before, but we don't know the circumstances just yet. The last important thing here is learning a bit more about the lance. We learn that its magic is powerful enough to disrupt the king's protective magic. Stroll tests this by attacking Will, and he doesn't get cooked on the spot. So this is a valid avenue to get Luis. Since we have to present a lance to Luis, Nuris crafts a replica, and obviously there's going to be some sort of switcheroo business coming up. In the background, Luis has been conspiring with a hooded figure and a sensible heel. The plot starts to move really quickly from here on out because we're approaching the end game. The group has a really nice send-off where they leave Virga Island, which Adeni has renamed Etria, since Virga basically means savage. The non-Mustari people called it the Virga Island, so obviously they picked a bad word because this is an awful racist world. On the night of the party, you can choose to spend one-on-one time with someone. I chose Gallica because I was hoping it would offer some backstory on her and Will. Their relationship has just gone completely unexplored, so they just chat. Juna also has a scene with Del and Bass where Del is like, you guys are planning to use this lance on Luis, aren't you, dulcet diva? And Juna plays dumb, but Del is hot on their trail. Basilio is kind of starting to wake up a little, and he's questioning Luis's intention and how Del and Bass will fare in Luis's proposed new normal. It's important to note that he's having doubts. Afterwards, we head to Altabury. There is an opera house where Juna has been booked to sing, booked and blessed. This will be when the second round closes and everyone will present their stolen artifacts. The current plan is to strike Luis with the lance while Juna is singing, and since Yufa is the lance's wielder and has this like magic connection to it, she can magic it back to her, so they're hoping to basically leave no trace. I love a silly opera plot. I think every fantasy RPG needs a Dragon Age, Inquisition, Wicked Eyes and Wicked Hearts moment where you break from the game's typical conventions and spend time in an opulent venue. During the show, we execute the plan, but Luis has plot armor for the game, which granted keeps the narrative going. He gets injured, but of course he doesn't die. And also, now he has the lance. We are known traitors now, so we have a grand boss fight with him on the theater's roof and kill him for real. Like, he crashes through the ceiling, is bleeding out on the stage. He's confirmed dead by the robed person wearing the heels. Mischief is afoot. Stroll is the king of PR, so he offers the lance as their relic, and Forden is a little iffy on how bloody their campaign trail has been so far, which honestly, valid. Del and Baz are pissed. that we basically killed their hope for an equitable future. And the party is like, hey, I hope this makes you feel better, but we're trying to save the prince who is still alive. And Del is like, the old king was so shitty. Like, why would I want his son, who's been in a coma his whole life, to be a ruler? Which honestly is the best retort he could have given. The party hasn't really grappled with the notion that the prince might suck. They've really just been committed to this birthright line of thinking. Speaking of the prince, he's still in a coma, so either Luis didn't cast the spell or he's still alive. Or maybe a secret third option that is both. Who can ever be sure? The next day, Forden is about to announce whatever the next thing is going to be when, jaw drop, Luis is still alive. The hooded figure was actually Zorba, and he healed Luis in the chaos. Luis also has the real lance now, and he gets Forden. No stunt. Forden actually gone. He doesn't have plot armor because he's not as interesting as Luis. I was starting to get a little bit nervous that Rella was the traitor because she also wears a fierce heal, but she's not. More on that in a minute. Luis also randomly goes to shoot a magic laser at some children who didn't escape the theater quickly enough. Del and Baz defend them from the blast long enough for them to get away, but then Luis strikes again and is about to kill Baz, but Fidelio jumps in the way, sacrificing himself to protect his brother. Like I said, I got spoiled for the last two party members, so I knew it was going to be Basilio, and I had a feeling that Del was going to die. There's a lot of talk about how it's like over for him after he hurts his ankle. I got spoiled that Basilio was going to be our last party member, so I had a feeling that Del was going to die to push Bass's story forward. Del was the smart, capable one, and Bass was kind of just like following his brother for the ride, and Del was obviously dealing with a bigger internal conflict as to whether or not following Luis was the right thing to do. I was hoping that he would just be like a passive crew member and just like hang out on the ship, and that also would have given him more opportunity at a redemption arc, but unfortunately, metaphor demands blood. You can only redeem yourself through death, and this will not be the last time we see this implemented in the narrative. The next day, Basilio is obviously grieving, but he hears his brother's spirit and awakens to the Berserker archetype, another strong physical damage dealer. Rella is immediately announced as Forden's replacement and quickly enters her villain era. This is so short-lived, like she brainwashes a whole group of people in Altabury and then says, come to the Mage Academy ruins if you want the truth. So we go, we fight her and this ice dragon. We learn that Rella has her own magic relic that can absorb a dragon, and she just attacks us. Like, it's very unhinged. After defeating her, she reveals that this was all pretty much a ruse. She wanted to test that we were strong enough to get the job done. She also invites us to Gag City and reveals that she cursed the prince. The plot against the prince had nothing to do with Luis. It was all orchestrated by the church. Forden forced her to do it and basically said, hey Rella, I know that you're only 12 years old, but that cute little sister of yours, wouldn't it be really bad if something happened to her? And you are the most magical woman on this earth. So what if you cast a little spell? I'm trying so hard to not make a Harry Potter reference. What if you cast a little spell on the mixed race prince, who is half Clamar, half Elden, and we the church do not like that. Rella sends out a telepathic message to the people endorsing Will for the throne, and then she literally fridges herself to lift the prince's curse. Rella was also affected by the curse herself, so she was kind of running out of time. The prince is still asleep, but at least the thorns are gone. I am disappointed in Rella's role in the story, mostly because it all happens so fast. Like, she has little seeds planted throughout that something really intense is going on with her, but it all culminates in this one moment, and the end of the game is like a little rushed. Her arc was like a firework, like it really burned bright, faded quickly. I was also hoping for more from her because I thought that she would be our party's main magic user, but that ended up going to Yufa. And again, there's only atonement through death. So on to Act 3. Sorry if the camera angle is different. I had to take a break because all of my devices died. We return to the capital to stand off against Luis. He can rotate between elemental affinities with his sword, so he can exploit any weakness, but after getting him down to about a third of his health, it is a scripted loss, and he overloads Will with Magla and turns him into a human. Very reminiscent of Sora becoming a Heartless in Kingdom Hearts 1. This also made me notice how the orange markings that have turned purple in this instance look very similar to the Demi-Fiend from SMT3 Nocturne, which was apparently a huge inspiration for Metaphor ReFantazio. The combat in Metaphor is heavily based off of SMT3. Correct me if I'm wrong. Luis elects for a very effective strategy strategy by giving the people a common enemy. And even though he was responsible for turning Will into a human, he uses this to validate the bias that the Elda people bring calamity, and it's because they're secretly human. Will recovers pretty quickly, but in the meantime, Zorba has discovered the forest village where Will and Gallica are from, and he goes there to kill the prince. The party also heads to the forest, thinking it's time to reunite with the prince now that they have fallen out of public favor and the curse has been lifted. They go to the ancient Elden sanctuary in the middle of the woods, and they notice that they've all seen this place before when they got their archetypes. The woman who spoke to them was, of course, the dead Elden queen. Zorba has been doing damage around the forest, but it seems like he can't get into the sanctuary for whatever reason. They see the prince again, and if you can guess what I'm about to reveal, you win a prize, and I will mail it to you myself. I'll get on the plane and hand deliver it, actually. If you guessed that Will is the prince, congratulations, you're so smart. Keep an eye out on the mailbox. There's going to be a Nobel Prize in there soon. Will is a manifestation of the prince's will. The prince used to read the fantasy novel all the time, which happens to be a relic imbued with a ton of magic power. So once the curse got bad enough to put the prince in a coma, Will was basically born to continue living the prince's life. There are some other hints pointing to this reveal throughout the game. Will and the prince look exactly alike. The prince doesn't have a name, and Will and Gallica have some weird memory stuff happening throughout the game, which made their already limited backstories seem quite unreliable. Will had a bunch of fake memories of being childhood friends with the prince injected into him. Will and the prince merge. It's very Byleth absorbing Sothis, in that they both get lighter eyes and hair. We also unlock royal archetypes at this point, which are the strongest classes in the game, but they're hard to get because you need to master multiple class lines in order to get to them. The prince archetype is given to us for free though. Gruide, this very cool old Elden lady riding around on a magic carpet, shows us the murals in the sanctuary that further describe this ancient war, and that originally there was just one race called the human race. The tribes began to emerge as a result of magical mutation over the centuries. It's no accident that Elda sounds like elder, because they are the evolutionary point of origin. The Elda never mutated from the pre-apocalyptic people. That's why they don't have the discernible physical trait that establishes the tribes. The discovery of magic is what caused the war back then, which is supported by the Mustari murals. The human, quote-unquote human monsters are confirmed to be people that have been corrupted by so much magic, which tracks. We saw Luis do that, and people for whatever reason started referring to these monsters as humans, so the Elda had to rebrand after their name was co-opted. Gruide also thinks that Luis is an Elda of House Caradrius because he is too magically powerful to not be an Elda. He also came from a brilliant family of doctors, contributing to this overall evil prodigy vibe that he has going on. At some point during Luis's childhood, the church came to burn down the sanctum, killing his whole family, so it's suspected that Luis's attempt at the throne is a revenge ploy to get back at the people who took something from him. I'd like to take a minute to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I'd like to take a minute to talk about today's sponsor, The Night Prowler. I'd like to take a minute to talk to you today about cheetah print cats. I'd like to take some time to talk about more. He is also an amnesiac. If no one has amnesia, are you even writing a video game? We know he's the writer of the fantasy novel. The novel was given to Will as the prince by his parents, and right after all of these reveals, he also hears the Elden Queen's voice and recognizes her, so he must have gone to the Elden Sanctum at some point. He's remembering small pieces, but nothing substantial. That's my aside for now. We return to the capital, and the skies are red, everyone's angry. Remember, magic comes from bad feelings, so this is all pretty dire. Luis is like over the king's game. He just flies up to the palace island and goes to get the royal scepter, which is another one of these powerful magical items that can channel the king's divine magic. He is basically using it as a magic battery, absorbing all of these negative feelings so that he can realize his vision of the world. He's going to turn everyone into a human by overloading them with magic, and only the strong-willed are going to be able to break themselves out of that, and they will essentially become the chosen people. So when he said equality, he never wanted to change attitudes, just the data set. The people are also either terrified of him because they don't think they'll survive if they don't support him, or they're just a blind Luis stan. Oh, and Luis is also confirmed to be Elda because he takes off his horns. They were a magically affixed costume headband. The only reason I talked about all that Will disguising stuff at the beginning was because I did have that thought while playing the game, and then this scene happened. I have a feeling that the writing was trying to like drop a hint there and put it into your mind. Maybe there's some analysis to be had about Luis assimilating and attempting to hide himself within the popular tribe, whereas Will refused to hide himself, and one of them becomes the king and one of them doesn't. You know what I mean? One of them is rewarded by the narrative for being themselves and being honest, and the other one is shafted at the very end. For our final mission, we fly up to the castle as well. Oh, I forgot to mention Nuris. Again, he's an engineer in the background. The gauntlet runner has wings now. After cutting through the palace dungeon, we fight Zorba for the last time, and he is part human now. So he's sentient, but he's taken on this really grotesque form. The party defeats him once and for all, and then he monologues at us before jumping off of a building again, which he did at the beginning of the game. I feel like Zorba effectively illustrates the desperation with which the disenfranchised people of this world were for a solution and for a better life for themselves. A valid option for a lot of people was joining the army. So Zorba was a mage, but he wasn't good at combative magic, so they had him doing other roles. But Luis saw that Zorba was a really talented mage. That's why he kind of focused on this necromancy thing. So, you know, he's being shunned by everybody else, but Luis was really there to pull him up. Same with the Parapus tribe. Like, the government literally performs experiments on them because they are seen as animals with less valuable disposable bodies. Luis had some great thoughts. I think if he was cooking with a different brain, he could have been the greatest villain of all time. But unfortunately, he is pure evil. He's like a narrative force. He is an idea more than like a character with personhood. But from Luis, what I would have really liked is a more vulnerable Sephiroth. A moment for a Final Fantasy VII aside. Luis has been compared a lot to Sephiroth, and I think a lot of the big pieces between those characters are all the same, so that comparison makes a lot of sense. Both are military men, both have been done wrong by their respective power structures, both are metaphorically, pun intended, fallen angels who come from an enlightened, powerful, ancient people who have gone extinct or are about to. In Sephiroth's case, he just believes that he is. Spoiler, sorry. And for people who regularly play Atlas titles, Luis's design is like pretty clearly based on how they depict Lucifer in other media, and Lucifer is the poster child for the fallen angel concept. It's kind of his whole deal. Both men feel an entitlement to change the world that wronged them as they see fit. Where they differ is their execution. Granted, there is more FF7 content in general to expand Sephiroth's story and gain more insight on him as a character, but even without the extra information, we know that Sephiroth learning the truth of his birth drives him crazy. He stews in the basement. I don't know why that scene really resonates with me. I feel like I've talked about it in several videos. It's nuts. It's very good, but it's nuts. And now Sephiroth bears the weight of supposedly being the last of his people, and he wants to reclaim an Earth that was stolen. Sephiroth is a little bit more psychotic. In Luis's case, there are an Elda people who have been pushed to the margins. He doesn't represent them though. He doesn't care. Luis's motivations are in the same sort of ballpark, but he doesn't have very much on-screen development. A lot of Luis's time being fleshed out as a character and a person in this world is other characters speculating on how he might feel or what he might believe or what might be the truth of his life. There is no vulnerability. There is no personhood. He is evil. That's his purpose in this story. It's to be awful and contrary and to be the bad guy that the heroes band against. That's the uniting force of these people, is to get back at Luis. Luis just happens to have a couple of interesting justifications that may or may not be true. And when the party is like, hey, are you kind of just like a traumatized little boy? He's like, I don't even want to talk about that. And then they're like, okay, how about the Elda? Like, are you trying to save the Elda? Is that who this is for? And he's like, actually, no. The Elda suck shit. They're cowards. My parents dying in a fire was a skill issue, and I didn't want to live in the forest anymore. You see how that loses steam? We could have had one of the greatest villains of all time. They just had to write him as a person. Anyways, next we fight Luis. He looks hot as hell. We get the upper hand. He flees. There's a dramatic scene where a bunch of humans stampede the party and they tell Will to get on the Skyrunner. During the party's fake out death scene, Heisme tells Basilio that he's one of the good ones. This is what he actually says.
Sure you want to die next to me, old man? Thought you ate Parapus. It's true, I don't understand you and I never will. But I know I don't hate you, boy.
If I was in Basilio's shoes, that's not the apology that I would maybe want. It just seems like a little disingenuous and like weird timing to be like, ugh, I know we're about to die, but just to be clear, I don't hate you. I just hate what you are. Will makes it to Luis. Luis overloads him with magic again, so Will is on the brink of becoming human, but he rips his heart out. Not in the fun little microphone hearts from the beginning kind of way. He jills himself. Moore brings him to academia and he seems mentally unwell, and this is because Moore has his memories back. He then teleports us to the utopia, this fantasy that he describes in his novel, and demands that we stay here, saying Uchronia is the fantasy and Shibuya Crossing is reality. But Will is like, no, experience is the proof of existence, and that's my home. These are my friends. I'm not staying. There's a brief easy fight with Moore, and then we head back to the action alive again. This sequence was really cool for 5 seconds. It was just so short and low impact. Like, we've been reading about this fictional world throughout the text and in a really expansive way. Like, it's not just talking about cities with glass buildings. It's talking about like the nature of this world, people being together. They're portrayed as living full, decadent, abundant lives. I think if we also had any time to explore this urban metropolitan environment, it would have hit a little bit harder. If the setup had been stronger, Moore offering us this ticket to heaven might have been a little bit more tempting, but instead we get 2 character models chatting on a PNG image. It's a picture. Also, like, we've seen this trope in many a media. Going to the fictional world, you know what you need to do? All of Will's friends need to be there and they need to be doing something else. Basilio needs to be running a restaurant. Yufa should be like, I don't know, a social worker. Juna should be a baddie at university. Make Stroll like a flower salesman, a taxi driver. Make him Maruki from Persona 5. I feel like the scene of being in this other fantasy world is like 10 minutes tops. It can't be very long. Not to bring up FF7 again. Talking about this game is really like a culmination of all of the games that I like. FF7 Rebirth is not my favorite game in the world, but sometimes you do need Cloud and Aerith going on a date in another dimension in order to get the white materia. More needed to happen with this plot point than just like asking if the player has the guts to see the end of the game. It's also relevant to note that at some point prior, Will and Gallica finished reading the book, and it doesn't end with a hopeful message. It actually concludes with the idea that utopia is not possible. You can't arrive at utopia. You have to keep working at it, right? And the work will never be done because someone will always be dissatisfied in any set of circumstances. It's not feasible. It's not feasible. Things are too complicated. So like narratively, we already have the clarity that this is not where we want to be. Big reveal. Moore is King Hythlodius V. He's your dad and he has depression. He's a manifestation of a younger version of the king, the same way that Will was a manifestation of the prince. Back to reality, the party catches up with us. We fight Luis for the last time. He transforms into a big head with wings, and then in the second phase, he's a different head with different wings. Will merges with the ship and becomes a Megazord and slices Luis in half. He is then crowned the king, and people are happy. Listen, I'm not saying that we deserved like a Luis redemption arc. Like, I think if Luis was just like dead on the street and then like the party came across him and he had like a really like a vulnerable moment, like he grabs Will by the hand and he's like, we're like you and I, we both wanted to be the king. Both of our lives were ruined by the church and by the kingdom. We walked very similar paths. We both read the same book and we drew very different conclusions from it. Knowing the full picture and seeing everything that they executed, Luis is not compelling. He just had the potential. Anyways, the epilogue is pretty cool. Jaime and Basilio are friends. I guess the "you're one of the good ones" talk went over well off screen. Anyways, we get to see how the characters are doing a year later. The party are dubbed the King's 6 Partisans and have roles of high importance due to their proximity to Will. Stroll is a general. Hulkenberg becomes the lady of her house and the King's Guard, so she's satisfying that like protecting the prince thing. Heismay is the leader of the Royal Knights. Juna is the next headmistress of the Mage Academy. Igniters have been debunked as a tool to prevent people from getting a better understanding of magic because they never needed igniters to access magic. They just needed to be taught. And research being done by the Mage Academy is going to be publicly available. Yufa is a chief magistrate and Basilio is a brigade captain. For the non-party members, Nuris has become a chief engineer, also for the kingdom, but he isn't included in the 6 partisans for whatever reason. I don't like that. Alonso is part of a citizens council. Barden is the head of the provincial lords. Brigida is making igniters that are just children's toys. It's very sweet. Katharina is traveling to other countries beyond Uchronia to do recon. Maria is still a child, so no big update from her, and that's okay. Will is following in his father's footsteps, writing a book. Moore has presumably passed on to the afterlife after talking to the disembodied voice of his wife. Justice for Will's unseen mom. Then in the last scene, Maria joins the group on the runner and sees beyond the capital for the first time now that the outside world isn't ravaged by monsters. That's the game! A quick change. And we'll be right back. Wow, I did a good job. What a ride we've been on together. If there are any questions, keep them to yourself. I wish I was done talking about this game, but I've really hitched my horse to the app wagon. Normally I would talk about each social link, but I think they're fine. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them are kind of mid. None of them are bad. Strolls is about trying to rebuild his house, and when he can't, he finds his inheritance and reconnects with the people from his town and buys them houses. Through Heismay, we learn more about the Ujif while he tries to spread his son's remains. Juna sings for a benefit concert and reveals that the Nydia are short and sweet Sabrina Carpenter people.
Oh, I leave quite an impression.
Who use magic to change themselves once they hit maturity. They're literally just chibi people. Basilio's link deals with the repercussions of being put through unethical experimentation in his youth, which is sad, which is horrible. Brigida is a standout to me as a side character with a lot of distance from the main plot. She's trying to change the igniter industry and help disenfranchised children because she was really poor growing up. And Barden, I love a statue of a man with a soft spot and just a little bit of an insecurity. That's so hot. And he sends us presents. Like, fine, you can take me to dinner. I would have loved more Adeni content though. We need more men dressed like this in video games. I do really enjoy the cast overall. Gallica comments on how she doesn't feel like she can contribute as much because she's just a little navigator. It's nice to have the small sidekick participate in the story as an actual character. Stroll does a lot of what a main character does, since Will's agency is entirely limited by trying to reconcile being a self-insert and an active character. Stroll does a lot of the group's public speaking. He's really good at it, but he is responsible for a lot of like the ideology of this team. Juna is the character of all time, obsessed with her, love. I do wish they talked about her being a spy more. She was really doing like a double agent shtick for a while, and then once that kind of no longer is relevant, we don't hear about it anymore. And it's so interesting. Like, what did that job interview look like? Who did you talk to? Yufa does the typical cleric princess thing. She's detecting magic and she's usually the character connecting the lore together. Yufa has a little crush on Will, which felt really natural, especially because the other women around Will aren't desperate to
sucking dick and cock
like the Persona girls are written. Juna flirts a little, and it's initially kind of dubious how serious this might be, but when she takes the job at the Magic Academy, she's not like, Will, you're not gonna come, right? Like, she's not inviting him to the mountains for a little ski trip chalet moment. Yufa's dropping hints. Basilio is fun. Atlas writers really love a giant man who can cook. I want to touch on the combat specifically too. This game, kind of hard. I feel like I followed the class progressions pretty accurately to what the game wants people to do, and based on what I'm seeing online, many of us made the same decisions. Stroll was generally a damage dealer. Hulkenberg was more defensive. I did find it annoying that her royal archetype was hitched to the mage class line since her magic isn't very good, but they wanted everyone on the cast to specialize in a couple of the archetypes, so I get it. Stroll's main line is warrior and his secondary is commander. For Hulkenberg, it's knight and then mage. For Will, you don't need to max out anything because you get the prince for free, so they give Yufa the summoner and the seeker lines. I maybe would have rotated the secondary classes of the three, giving Yufa mage, Hulkenberg Commander and Stroll Seeker. But then I can also see a reality where there's just quite a bit of overlap for each unit. So I don't know. They're not paying me the big bucks to make games. They're actually not paying me the big bucks to do literally anything. Like and subscribe. Heismei's Royal archetype is extra annoying to get because you have to get pretty high levels in 3 class lines, which requires way more EXP than any other character needs. But this is because Heismei's Royal archetype has an insane dodge chance and a passive that ends the enemy's turn if you do dodge. So it's like a busted thing that they're gatekeeping. It makes sense that there's like a high barrier to that. Juna needs to max out Masked Dancer and Faker, so she's really primed to be a utility debuffer, and Basilio needs Berserker and Brawler, making him a heavy hitting physical damage dealer. The only class that isn't assigned to anybody is the healer, but there is a quest really early on to get healer to rank 10, which rewards you with access to the archetype screen from the main menu, which is so convenient. And the party doesn't have a dedicated magic unit for the first like 30 hours of the game, so I'm finding that a lot of players opt to go all in with Will on magic, which is what I did. You can choose Will's stats, so there's flexibility in which direction you take him in, and for many people that's as a healer, especially because in the first dungeon, light magic kills. It's so good. My team comp is probably also going to sound quite familiar. I had Juna apply weaknesses and remove enemy buffs and ally debuffs. Basilio was the damage dealer of all damage dealers, and most people had Hulkenberg as their tank to draw damage and increase ally defenses. I had Stroll doing this instead for whatever reason. I think I just built him that way and it made more sense, but I did swap them out situationally because I didn't invest in Knight for Stroll, so it made more sense for Hulkenberg to be doing that role, especially because Knight gets a skill that draws enemy attention, so they'll only attack her. Also, I'm seeing that a lot of people had an easier time than me maxing out the archetype ranks. I thought it took forever. You do get the strongest weapons in the game by completing each character's archetype boards, but I finished the game with most characters around the 30% mark. Basilio was even less because he comes so late, but like, was everyone just like grinding endlessly? This game does have a pretty bad balance between the narrative and the samey kind of dungeon grinding, but I really wasn't trying to grind excessively. I guess that intensity is why other people got the Heismei Royal archetype, which is the only one I didn't unlock. I got the rest of them. There is also a lengthy side quest where you can fight these optional dragons that give you some really good gear. The first dragon was easy. It's a relatively normal boss. The other 2 dragons, literally ripping my hair out. It was so awful. And I went in without looking up beforehand, and I didn't like save scum or anything because that's not something I really do. The poison dragon, Devourer of Stars, reflects every single damage type and also has a skill that caps everyone's HP at 300, which is terrible. I really wanted to leave and go fight the other dragon. Like, I was really ready to bite the bullet, but once you have Katharina at max rank, she can show up at dungeons and deal extra damage to enemies at the beginning of combat, and I wasn't gonna forfeit starting the fight with an extra free 5,000 damage. I kind of knew after enough rounds of doing it that I would kind of have to get lucky with the RNG and the turn order and not proc whatever condition that lets the dragons get like actually 10 turn icons and just really effortlessly party wipe your team. You kind of have to just cast weaknesses on it and wait. Dance of Purge Light and Radiant Crusher, you will always be famous. You will always be famous. Like, when I beat the Devourer of Stars, I actually released an audible noise of relief. Like, I was so glad it was over. The Devourer of Flames is the other dragon. It's pretty easy if you play the game right. Also, notice how I don't know the name of the first dragon, but the other 2 are forever etched into my memory. I could have named that first dragon for literally $1 million. The actual challenge of the Devourer of Flames is that it has an attack that deals almost 10,000 damage, which is an instant kill. There are 4 pieces of equipment that you can get that block fire damage. I had only 2 at the time, and I think they were from fighting the other 2 dragons. The other one is like an item upgrade that I had the item. I just hadn't upgraded it, and I also didn't know because I didn't prepare for this fight beforehand. And there's a side quest where you have to collect golden beetles, and once you collect all of the beetles the guy is asking for, he gives you another piece of equipment that blocks fire. I circumvented this by casting Makara Karn with Juna, which repels magic attacks. It only protected 1 extra member because it's a lot of MP and hard to get it on 2 characters in a single round, but repelling attacks ends the enemy turn, so it was really effective, just like minimizing what the dragon could do. The last boss, because of course beating 3 dragons is never enough. It has to culminate in a fight against Shadow Will, the Epilogue of Souls, who rotates through archetype skills each turn. I'm sure this fight is easy if you follow a guide and you can kind of prepare for what skills are coming next, because it seems to do the same actions or follow the same patterns each turn. I just winged it. It was also quite difficult, but I did learn my lesson after the 2 dragons, and I started playing smarter, not harder. That's not everything though, because on New Game Plus, you can fight the secret 5th dragon from Hell, which is locked inside of a book in academia. I'm not reading all that. I'm happy for you. I'm sorry that happened. Oh my goodness. Closing thoughts. We're almost done, thank God. I'm sure you know what I think about this game. I've talked about it in excruciating detail, and there are many stones I've left unturned. So if you sat through this and you haven't played Metaphor, there's still stuff in that game for you to see. And also thank you for listening to me ramble for forever. You know, it's a sweet thing to do. Obviously, I recommend getting this game if you have like 80 hours to sink into it. If you don't, wait for a sale. I don't know. I would love to know what you guys thought of the game if you played it. I'm also especially curious to know if you've played it and you're not a Persona fan and you've never played Persona. For me, like, I'm a longtime Persona fan. I've been really into it for 10-ish years at least. It would be really hard for me to discuss Metaphor without considering Persona, but I would be so interested to hear from people who don't have that overlap. It's also clear that Metaphor ReFantazio is like a love letter to Atlas games. 3 of the class lines are called Devil Summoner, Soul Hacker, and Persona Master, which all reference different side franchises attached to Shin Megami Tensei. I also think like Edeni renaming the Virga Island to Etria is supposed to be a nod to Etrian Odyssey. I'm curious to know if anybody is working on like the Pixar Theory equivalent video where it is linked that all of these take place in like the same universe. I think there's perhaps an argument to be made that the apocalypse that happens in Soul Hackers 2, it might be the one. It might be the one that brought us here. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Let me know if you liked the really long video. I'm sure this is going to be a bitch to edit. You know, videos this long aren't always feasible for me, but I was like really excited to talk about this game. I really wanted to. And I just found that like when I was writing, I literally couldn't take me away from the keyboard. I had a lot of fun making this video. I have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting me over there. I'm a university student and I have like a physical in-person job as well. So I'm not in a place where I can offer much in addition right now, unfortunately. In the future, I would love to. Maybe if this becomes my full-time, who can ever be sure? I also have a coffee if you're interested in supporting me on there. You can get a YouTube thanks. You can become a YouTube channel member. Subscribing is huge. Just being here is huge. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also trying to be a little bit more forward with like channel updates and just like saying what I'm working on. I'm kind of into the weekly sort of update format just to say like, I've written this many pages. I'm at this level of progress with this video. I've only been doing that for a couple weeks now, but I feel like it's nice to be like, hi, do you guys want to watch this? Just so you know, I'm still in the background. I'm still working. Yeah, please let me know about your thoughts down below, and I will see you next time. Love, Juna, but I have another songstress to be thinking about right now. Never underestimate a singer. No, I feel like that's giving Jennifer Coolidge. Never underestimate a singer. The gays love me, and I don't know why. Are you guys gonna see Wicked? Don't miss next time. I can't put that in the edit. Cut that.